Let's do a quick introduction to how to identify tissues. The first thing we need to do is a quick reminder from things that were discussed during the lecture component of course. That is that tissues are groups of cells. And because of that, when we go to name tissues, what we really end up doing is describing the cells and how those cells fit together or not. It's that combination of cells and cells together that gives tissues their names. Before we begin on naming tissues, we need to talk a little bit about cells and the way they look. Human cells and tissues are mostly transparent on their own. If I take a sample of tissue, throw it onto a microscope slide and try to look at it under a microscope, I probably won't be able to see much in the way of the cellular structures. So, to help with that, tissues and cells are usually treated with some kind of stain or dye that sinks into different parts of the cells a little more deeply and helps us visualize structures that are in those cells. So, all of the images we're going to be looking at for our tissues and cells are going to have a lot of colors in there. And those colors are really meant to emphasize different structures in those cells. But the colors themselves don't actually matter since they aren't real components of the cell. They're a dye added to help us see different structures. The reason we care about that is if you're studying to try to name tissues, it's okay to study with images that are in color because the images on your practical will be in color. But it's also okay to study with pictures that are in black and white. As long as you can see the structures, that's all we really need in order to be able to name cells and tissues. The other thing we need to know is that there's a kind of process that we can follow to help us name tissues that's called a dichotomous key. Now that's a new word to a lot of folks, but many people have done a dichotomous key before. They just called it something different. Maybe they called it a decision tree or a mind map or a flow chart. The way a dichotomous key works is you typically start by asking some kind of question. Now, this is a dichotomous key because the questions will typically have only two possible answers: yes, no, true, false, inside, outside. Whatever it is, there's usually only two possible answers to a question. Now, if we say yes to a question, it's going to lead us in one direction, and if we say no, it leads us in a totally different direction. Typically, either of those answers will lead us to a new question, but they'll lead us to different questions from each other. This new question is part of a dichotomous key, so it typically has two possible answers of its own: yes, no, true, false, inside, outside. Depending on the answer to that new question, we go into new directions. Maybe to a third possible question, or maybe to an answer. If the answer to a question leads us to another question, well, it's typically only going to have two possible answers as well: yes, no, true, false, etc. At the end of the process, we should come to some point where we have an answer. Something that's going to be really important to keep in mind as you try to apply a dichotomous key is that you need to always start with the very first question for the key. If you try to skip around or take shortcuts, you're probably going to wind up getting very lost, confused, and angry during the process. If I start with the first question and I answer it either yes or no, in this case I'm going to say yes, that's going to take me in a certain direction. I ask a new question, my answer to it may be no, and it leads me to a possible answer. But if I try to take a shortcut if I try to jump to a question without starting with the first question, let's say I try to start here instead, well, because of that, the way this dichotomous key works is I can really only work my way down on this dichotomous key. There's no way to go from this question to the true answer that I really want. It always works best to start with the first question and go in order. Typically, to name any tissue, you're only going to have to ask somewhere between 1 and 4 to 5 questions. But what's really, really important here is asking those questions in order. If I ask those questions one way, I may wind up going down a different branch than if I go and answer those questions in a different way. So coming up, we need to take a look at a dichotomous key that could be used for naming tissues.